Hello, I'm Hugh Kirkwood. I work at Kitasato University, and in this presentation I'm going to suggest that the way people engage in discourse in online communities may play a role in helping to reproduce their employment conditions. Now, you might be interested in teaching English in Japan, or you might be interested in more in applied linguistics. So depending on your interest, you might not know all of the words or be familiar with all of the words in this title. So quickly, I'm going to go through each one and explain what each word in the title is and kind of explain who and what my research is all about. So the who are we talking about? Well, ALTs are a type of teacher in Japan. It stands for Assistant Language Teachers who work in Japanese schools, elementary schools, junior high schools, senior high schools, usually public schools, and they're often not Japanese. They're usually quote-unquote native speakers. And to be hired as an ALT, you typically require a university degree, but not much else. So you don't really require a teaching qualification to be an ALT. This information is available in Otani 2010. So what's the online discourse I'm talking about? Well, I'm talking about discourse on Reddit. It's a popular discussion site. And within Reddit, there are subreddits. And one subreddit is dedicated to teaching in Japan, teaching in Japan, which is public. Anybody can look at it and view the comments and replies to the comments. And I use the search term ALT to find all the posts and replies related to ALTs. And I collected these posts between the 19th and the 20th of February 2020, which you can see was just before the COVID-19 thing really kicked off in Japan. I collected 100 posts and all associated comments, the replies to those posts. And I selected the 100 posts based on the number of replies. So I ranked the posts according to their reply, the number of replies, and I took the text from the top 100 posts and replies. Let's look at the discourse analysis, the applied linguistics side of things. So what does the word critical mean as I'm using it? Well, I'm using it in a kind of special way, a way proposed by Norman Fairclough, who's a famous figure in critical discourse analysis. And his book, Language in Power, well, the second edition, defines critical as such. It means the special sense of aiming to show up connections that may be hidden from people, such as the connections between language, power, and ideology. So what might be hidden? What might the participants in the discourse not be aware of? That's what we're talking about. Okay, and the methodology I used was corpus analysis. So what is a corpus? First of all, let's give a textbook definition of that. This is from Bieber et al. In 1998. A corpus is a body of text that represents a language or some part of a language. Okay, so in this case, the part of the language I'm looking at is ALT's online discourse. And I used corpus software to help me analyze this corpus. And what corpus software can do, according to Scott in 2010, it can help you sort text in a corpus. So you can sort text by word frequency, or you can look at particular words and look at the words in the context of text that comes before it or comes after it. That's concordance lines. The word frequencies can be displayed in word lists. And you can also compare a target corpus with a reference corpus, a much larger corpus that represents a more general view of a language, and generate keyword lists, which are words that stand out more than you would expect. So the corpus I created, the target corpus, is nearly 300,000 words. The reference corpus I used was the British National Corpus, the XML version published in 2007, which is nearly 100 million words and was designed to represent the English language in a more general way. So what were my research questions? Well, the first was, what are the keywords in the Teaching in Japan ALT corpus? What stands out? Which words stand out compared to a reference corpus? And then what is suggested by critical analysis of these keywords in context? So yeah, when looked in context of concordance lines, what can you what can you find out about the way these words are used, and what does it suggest about the relationship of this discourse to power or ideology? Okay, so what are the top 10 keywords in the ALT corpus? Number 1, ALT. Well, no surprise, that was the search term I used. 2, redacted. Okay, this is a company name. I'm just not giving the name because just in case something legal stuff happens. Okay, it's an employer of ALTs, a big one. Number 3, Japan. Number 4, I. So I is a pronoun. It's used a lot in the English language, but it's used in this target corpus much more than you would expect. 5, ALTs, ALTs. Okay. 6, you, another pronoun, used much more than you would expect. 7, teaching. 8, Japanese, could be the Japanese language or Japanese people or Japanese institutions. 9, eikaiwa, a Japanese word which means English conversation, but is usually used to refer to language schools, private language schools that teach small numbers of students, and is an alternative employer for language teachers and English teachers in Japan. Then we have 10, dispatch. This refers to a type of company which hires ALTs. These are contracting companies that local areas make contracts with, and they provide the local areas with ALTs to work in their schools. And they also manage, the dispatch companies manage these ALTs. And the number 2, the redacted company, that is a dispatch company. Okay, and I generated this keyword list using ALT, which is software created by Lawrence Anthony and published. This version was published in 2019. When I discuss these keywords in context, I'm going to look at ALT and ALTs together to save time, and also Japan and Japanese together to save time. And teaching, I'm going to look at teach and teacher together with teaching, because they're all part of the same family of words. How do we look at the keywords in context? Well, that's where the concordance lines I mentioned earlier come into play. Here's some concordance lines. You can see the word you're focused on, and then you can see the text to the left and the right of it. And you can kind of get an idea about how the word is being used. And because there may be many times that the word is used, it might not be possible to look at all of these instances. So what you can do is you can sample it in some way. For example, John Sinclair, who's a famous corpus linguist, proposes looking down a list, a sample of the lines, and categorizing each line and continuing to do this until new patterns do not emerge. And that's what I did. I randomized the lines and went down the list of lines, and when I felt there were no new patterns emerging, I stopped. And these lines I'm showing you, the example lines are from the British National Corpus, and this is a screenshot from ALT, which I mentioned earlier. Let's look at how I tagged the uses of the word ALT or ALTs. So many of these tags were related to job applications. People were looking at becoming ALTs or giving advice about becoming ALTs. Many people were also talking about the low status of ALT jobs. They argued they were unskilled or not real teaching jobs. Other uses of ALT were related to the low pay involved in ALT jobs. Many people argued it wasn't enough to live on, and an average figure was about 200,000 yen per month. And people were talking about ALT as a stepping stone. By this I mean they were arguing that while the job didn't have any value in the long term, perhaps ALT jobs have value in that you can move on from an ALT job to a better position, or in teaching or out of teaching. And finally, many people were talking about BOE, Board of Education contracts. They were talking about the contracts that may be made between boards of education or ALTs directly, or the contracts made between boards of educations and dispatch companies, the kind of ALT employers I mentioned earlier. Let's look at the redacted company name, use of this company name. Okay, well, this is why I'm not giving you the name. It's because most of the, or many of the usages were about it being a terrible company, a bad company, a shitty company. Often it was kind of hard to see why it was a shitty company, but that's how people were referring to it. And well, maybe this is one of the reasons why lots of people were talking about low pay paid by this company. Again, low, however, some people were interested in applying to this company or giving advice about how to apply to this company, or maybe not to apply to this company. Yeah, the stepping stone thing again. And yeah, people were talking about BOE contracts. Remember, this company makes a lot of contracts with local boards of education and is one of the main providers of ALTs to these boards of education. And in accommodation, this is about this company's practice of providing its employees, helping them find accommodation. However, many people were suggesting that the company was putting them in accommodation where they were paying rent more than they would if they'd gone straight to the letting agent themselves. So they were suggesting the company was taking a cut. Okay, let's look at Japan and Japanese. Again, many people talking about job applications. How can I get a job in Japan? Or to get a job in Japan, you need to blah, blah, blah. Yeah, and then people were also talking about Japanese language skills. What kind of Japanese language ability do you need to have a certain type of job in Japan? Then people were talking about the situation of English language teaching in Japan generally, and many people were saying, well, it's terrible, you know, it's hopeless, it's beyond repair. Yeah, not good stuff. And people were also talking about learning Japanese. So they're talking about giving advice and asking for advice about the best way to learn Japanese before or while living in Japan. And then there was a lot of people talking about cultural issues, maybe cultural misunderstandings, often with their Japanese co-workers, other teachers in their schools, or with their friends maybe, or the people around them. Okay. Now let's look at the pronoun I. So why was this used so much? Well, it was often used in giving advice. I think you should, if I were you, this kind of structure. And it was also used to ask for advice. What should I do? Yeah, or explaining a situation. I'm in this situation. Please give me advice. That kind of thing. There's more giving than asking. I think this kind of reflects the type of the structure of Reddit. You know, you have an original post. Somebody asks for advice or talks about their experience, and people respond, and you get more replies than you get questions usually. Well, that's what the person hopes, I assume. Okay, and then you've got anecdotes about teaching, anecdotes about working for a particular company, anecdotes about living in Japan. And also, I think you've misunderstood me. I said this, blah, blah, blah. So it's sort of, I used in the context of disputes with other people on the website, on the subreddit. This sample size was smaller than the other sample sizes because just the giving advice was so overwhelming. There wasn't really much there weren't really many new patterns coming. Okay, let's look at you, another pronoun. Again, there was a lot of advice, but I could kind of see more about what the advice was like this time around, and a lot of it was about career advice, what you should do to get a job, or what you should do to improve your job. There was also a lot of giving. There's other types of advice, not as much though. There was advice about learning Japanese or living in Japan, that kind of thing. And there was also asking for career advice. So that was a small part of the U, like what do you think I should do, that kind of thing. But that kind of structure wasn't so common, so it's not so pronounced in the discourse. With teach or teacher and teaching, many of the tags were related to career advice. And some tags were related to trouble people were having with other teachers, usually the Japanese co-workers in the public schools. Some people were talking or discussing about the ways to become qualified, the best way to get qualified, and which qualifications were required for which jobs. And some people were talking about the negative aspects of being a teacher in Japan or an assistant language teacher in Japan. Another thing people discussed was what they perceived to be a low quality of ALTs. They thought that other ALTs or some of the ALTs they knew were not, they shouldn't have been hired in the first place. They thought they were not committed enough to teaching, or they were just not skilled, or for whatever reason they didn't think they were up to scratch. And there was a little bit of discussion about teaching, like methodology, ideas, activities and so on, but as you can see, a lot of the discourse was more about teacher employment conditions than teaching itself. Okay, with eikaiwa, there was lots of comparisons with ALT jobs and eikaiwa jobs, the jobs in the private language schools. And generally there was a sense that the eikaiwa jobs were low-tier jobs on a similar level to ALT, only really worth being stepping stones to something better. And the salary was often described as pretty similar, although some people mentioned dispatch salaries were lower. And some people were interested in starting at eikaiwa, but they were weighing up their options with ALT jobs. But this is slightly different. Some people were interested in starting their own eikaiwa. One thing they were thinking of moving on to was making their own language school and being in control of their teaching and business. And they were getting business and teaching advice from other people on the subreddit. And often they talked about difficult conditions in eikaiwa, lots of classes, and a busy schedule. So here are the top tags for dispatch. The first is unethical contracting. So people engaged in the discourse were not happy that when making contracts with boards of education, dispatch companies were taking a large cut from the money they received from the BOEs. They were also not happy about dispatch companies undercutting other dispatch companies for taking less money from the BOEs and passing down the cuts to the ALT's salaries. Many people were also talking about their unhappiness that instead of hiring ALTs directly, more and more BOEs were shifting to using dispatch companies. And because of their displeasure with dispatch companies, many of the people engaged in the discourse wanted them completely destroyed or made illegal or whatever. And many people would not recommend joining an ALT company, dispatch ALT company to people online, and many people went a step further and said they should be boycotted. However, on the other hand, other people were using the stepping stone narrative and saying dispatch companies were a stepping stone to a better career in Japan or a better teaching job. And another reason people were unhappy with dispatch companies is because they were arguing this is a way for members of local governments or teachers in schools to avoid the hassle of managing and looking after ALTs that they hire. So I think I've given you a kind of overview of what people were discussing in the R Teaching in Japan subreddit about ALTs. But now in the remaining minutes we have, I want to talk about critical analysis of this discourse. Now, Norman Fairclough, who I mentioned earlier, talks about many aspects of vocabulary or grammar or context you can look at when you critically analyze discourse. But because the pronouns you and I stood out so much in the keyword list, let's discuss those. So Fairclough asks people to investigate how is you used in discourse, and because I stood out in the discourse so much, I'm going to talk about how you relates to I. And in my opinion, the way you is used is very much talking about what is best for you. I think getting this qualification is best for you. I think you shouldn't take this job. It's kind of taking an expert stance. Of course, you know, the people are asking people questions and people are replying. They're altruistic in that they're sharing information with these people, but there also seems to be a kind of egotistical angle to this. People are kind of showing off, you know, in the same way that you might do when you're using Instagram or Facebook or whatever. And while people are asking for advice, they might not really appreciate such a this kind of like expert stance. There's other things you can do when you give advice online. Morrow, in a 2012 book chapter, discusses people on Japanese internet forums using advice to kind of show solidarity with people, reassure them, and empathize with them. Maybe there's some of that on the Are Teaching in Japan subreddit, but often what I saw seemed to be more kind of, for want of a better word, one-upping and kind of telling people what they should do. Now, another pronoun Fairclough asks people to look at is we. Okay, now we, I haven't mentioned we. Where is we? Well, the reason why I didn't mention we is because it's a negative keyword. In fact, it occurs less than you would expect it to do in the language, if you look at the English language more generally. So maybe that's an interesting question to ask. Why does we not show up so much? Now, we is often used in solidarity, right? We, the people of Britain, or we the people, you know, generally. We need to, blah, blah, blah. But actually, it doesn't really feature in the discourse so much. So people are talking about acting as individuals rather than as groups. And maybe this reflects their ideology. Or it might be a feature of Reddit, you know, it's kind of like a question and answer type format, or replying to an individual type format. So maybe this genre of discourse, kind of the feature of that is people talk in individualized ways. But maybe, you know, the whole thing is connected to ideology. Maybe people using online taking part in online communities like Reddit are kind of, the way that the discourse is structured encourages them to think in terms of individuals and individual action rather than collective action. So this links to the effects of the discourse. What are the effects of this discourse? And Fairclough asks this question: does the discourse contribute to sustaining or transforming power relations? Well, in my opinion, the answer is sustaining. People talk about the conditions for ALTs as being overwhelmingly negative, but the solutions they propose are not solutions to improve the situation of ALTs generally. The solutions are how to escape from this horrible situation through getting better qualifications or whatever. And actually, this isn't a bad thing, I think. This is actually what helped me. I used to be an ALT, and I had lots of, well, there were problems with me being an ALT in my, you know, for my personal life and so on. And I was an ALT for 7 years working for a dispatch company. But I was helped by online discourse, not from Reddit, but from similar sites. And it helped me move on. But is this going to help ALTs generally? Is this going to help English language teaching in Japan generally? Maybe not. So maybe there's something else that people can do with online discourse. Of course, I saw on this on Are Teaching in Japan people talking about unions, people proposing to be their own dispatch company, coming up with interesting ideas, but overwhelmingly it was what you should do and what you ought to do and how you can be better qualified to escape ALT, not improve ALT. Thank you very much for listening. I'm looking forward to answering your questions and listening to your feedback on the conference day.